So welcome wherever you've joined from. My name is Raj Badressa. I'm an AWS authorized instructor delivering AWS training courses. I'll do a brief introduction very shortly, but you're here hopefully for the Getting Your Team Ready for Generative AI webinar that we're going to be running over the next 90 minutes or so. A couple of things just to cover off in terms of logistics, timing wise. Oops, let's see if I can pop that on. So from a timing perspective, I know some of you are from different time zones, so the expectations are that this will go from 11 a.m. for those of you Australian Eastern Standard Time for 90 minutes. So plan accordingly. I won't talk continuously for 90 minutes necessarily. We'll have a break round about in the middle after about 50 minutes. So we'll have a 10-minute break in the middle, so that way you can take a bit of a stretch. So a 10-minute break that we'll incorporate as part of that. And then if you have any questions, as Fiona's already mentioned, feel free to post the questions into chat and we'll address those as and when we can. I will also post some links and resources from to there as well as need be. And then finally, the session is being recorded, so if you can't stay for the full 90 minutes, we will be sending the recorded session and a link through to that as a bit of a follow-up email after the event. So those are the main logistics I want to call out. Before we start, just to set the expectations, just maybe do a brief introduction about myself. Let me tell you about me, and then I may ask you all to do something very similar. Peter, just in response to that question, we won't give you the slide decks necessarily, but you will get the recorded session. So the slide decks themselves, we can't provide. They have content that's copywritten from AWS, but what we can do is provide you, of course, the recorded session of everything we've covered. So that'll come as part of the follow-up. So hopefully that helps. But just a brief introduction about myself, and then I might ask you to all do something very similar, but maybe not to the same level of depth. My name, as you can see on both the slide and in the chat window, is Raj Badressa. I'll do my dad joke, as I always do. My surname can be pronounced like someone who doesn't dress well, a bad dresser. But yeah, I'll minimize the dad jokes over the next 90 minutes. I'm a software trader delivering training courses for Bespoke, who I've worked with and for the last 4+ years. I've also been delivering AWS training courses for 5+ years. Predominantly, my background is in IT infrastructure, bit of a jack of all trades, if you like, and been doing some work with machine learning, I guess, over the years. In fact, about 30 years ago, when I did my university degree, it had some discussions around machine learning then and artificial neural networks. My expectations for the next 90 minutes is to hopefully give you a good grounding on generative AI, some foundational knowledge, also some introduction to the various services that you can use to support that from AWS. So that's my expectations. Also, just to share something personal, I live in Auckland, New Zealand, so Aotearoa, New Zealand. Been living here for about 20 years, having moved from the UK. Kept fairly busy with family life, but the main reason I mention that is I've got a couple of dogs who will hopefully behave themselves like yourselves. I am connecting from home, or some of you may be connecting from home, so hopefully the distractions will be minimized, and hopefully my cat won't decide to come show her face on screen either. So that's me very briefly. Maybe just so I get an idea of where you all come from or where you're connecting from. You don't have to do a full introduction, but maybe just ping us in the chat window where you're from, where you're connecting from. So just have a bit of an idea of where the audience is. I know we've got a range of people who might be from Australia, New Zealand. I think also we've got some registrations in Singapore, India. So yeah, maybe just ping us a quick message. Perfect. Okay, so Mark from Australia. Okay. Oh, we've got someone from Florida. Okay, fantastic. Welcome. Brisbane. Australia, Queensland, connecting from Wellington. Fantastic. A few of you there. Okay. Also Melbourne represented, Auckland, okay. Sydney. Yeah, okay, so clearly a range, but a lot of you, of course, mainly from Australia, New Zealand. A couple of exceptions, clearly someone from the US. So welcome wherever you have connected from. That gives me an idea of where the audience is from, so I can deliver references accordingly. So let's crack on. This content is actually covered in 3 different parts. So the first part is going to be a general introduction to what generative AI is. So without getting into too much of the technical details, we will understand what generative AI is all about. And as you can see here, the theme of this particular part, okay, is the art of the possible. I'll then have 2 other sections, okay, planning a generative AI project. And then the final part that we're going to be looking at is talking about building a generative AI ready organization. So 3 parts. We'll probably have a short break after the first 2 parts have been covered off. So that's the plan. And as I said, and just to reiterate the point, in case any of you missed it, if you've joined us a little bit later, the content I'm presenting from, I can't share those slides necessarily. So I think there was a question earlier on from, I think, Peter. So I can't share the slides, but you will get a recording of this session if you want to review the content afterwards. I'll also share some resources as we go along in the chat window. So let's start the first part and really understand what generative AI is all about. I'm sure you've been hearing a lot of talk in the industry about generative AI. So let's get some foundational knowledge and understand what generative AI is all about if you're not already familiar with it. And really, we'll just go back a little bit into where generative AI has come from, and we'll talk about machine learning very briefly. Then build out some basics, some fundamentals of generative AI, and some of the potential use cases, which are growing, of course, as this technology emerges and matures. So let's start, first of all, with understanding machine learning. So to understand where generative AI has come from, we need to understand what machine learning is about. And machine learning, which is a subcomponent, a sub-aspect of artificial intelligence, I'll provide a bit of a visual around this. So what does machine learning allow us to do? It allows us to feed data into systems. So as this kind of picture shows, we've got this data set, and from that, the machine learning algorithm can look for patterns and then make predictions off the back of that, sometimes referred to as inferencing off the back of that. So maybe, for example, again, depending on your industry, maybe the data set we're having is financial transactions, and then it can recognize patterns which may indicate fraudulent behavior and then make predictions when a transaction looks like it could be fraudulent, for example. Or maybe it could be spam email classification. That's some good examples of machine learning, kind of classic machine learning, if you like. Now, Amazon have a rich history of machine learning, as we can see here, and I'll be very careful not to mention this word just in case any of you have these devices, and it could be the wake-up call for your devices. But we can see that Amazon have a rich history that goes back many years in terms of the use of machine learning in particular. And I guess that the extra ones that I want to highlight in particular here, actually, I'll just throw in an extra one. In 2017, Amazon released a service called SageMaker, or Amazon Web Services specifically. So SageMaker is going to be an important one, I think, that's worthwhile calling out here in this history lesson, if you like. And then a fairly recent mention to a service, or a couple of services, Code Whisperer and Amazon Bedrock. And they'll really be the services that we're going to be spending more of our time talking about over this particular webinar. Now, if you want to find out more about the general services that Amazon Web Services have around machine learning, I will direct you. In fact, I'll just post a link. Let me just post my first link here into the machine learning and artificial intelligence services that AWS have. And in fact, I might just do this as a quick demonstration. I'll just pop this on screen and I'll go to aws.amazon.com/AI. And from this particular link, which I'll just share in the chat window, you can find out about the various services that are AI related, I should say. And if you want to find out more about the specific products, you can then see there's some subcategories, and this will be quite interesting for us to see very shortly when we get to the slides. The products that are there then broken further into generative AI, machine learning, AI infrastructure, AI services, and data foundation for AI, as you can see there. So if I maybe start, because the whole theme of this webinar is generative AI, we'll see references to the various services and tools that can support generative AI, like Amazon Bedrock I've mentioned, Amazon SageMaker that I've mentioned, and Amazon Q. And I'll give some brief introductions to Amazon Q, but maybe focus most of our time on Bedrock and SageMaker. But yeah, there's a good start for finding out about those services. As I said, if you want to find out about them, of course, you can then get the links to the various services accordingly. So obviously a rich history. And let's just continue this high-level overview of generative AI. And I think to help understand generative AI, because there's, again, some different terms that we've already seen being mentioned here, let's start from the top. So the idea of artificial intelligence, as the name implies, is having human-like behavior and being able to make predictions, for example, using computers. So that's kind of the overall encompassing term, I guess, that artificial intelligence. And then a subcomponent of that, as we just looked at, is machine learning. So machine learning, looking for those patterns in the data and then making the predictions, or inferencing, as it's referred to. And then really as a subset of machine learning, we have something called deep learning. Now, deep learning uses the same kind of concept as our brain, where we have these artificial neural networks, or ANNs, these artificial neural networks, which can then again look for patterns in information or in data. And really, generative AI is a subcomponent, as we can see, of deep learning. So arguably, you could probably say that it shouldn't be called generative AI, it should be called generative deep learning or generative ML, but I don't think that rolls off the tongue in the same way that Gen AI does. So really, again, we can see this, the way that the different aspects kind of fit together. AI, been around for many, many years, ML, or machine learning, deep learning, and really generative AI, which is, like I said, our focus for this. And as we can see here, it's a subset of deep learning, but it can use what are called some foundation models that we're going to talk about without you potentially having to retrain or fine tune like we may have to do if we're just using our own machine learning approach. Now, of course, there's a lot of talk in our industry, and I guess even in the general kind of public domain around this idea of generative AI. And I guess it's captured a lot of people's imagination, whether you've been exposed to it through services like ChatGPT, for example. But I guess why are we talking so much about these kinds of concepts with generative AI now? And as we can see, there's kind of three aspects, I guess, that come into play here. The fact that there's a bigger team size in terms of people that are willing to work with the data that forms the foundation for generative AI, and this idea of willingness to go big. Part of the big aspect that we have with generative AI is this idea of what are called large language models, or foundation models. And I'll be defining those terms very, very shortly. But the fact that we can train the machine learning algorithms, the deep learning algorithms on data sets that are as big, as the internet. And of course, we think about the amount of data on the internet. This is what's the significant, I guess, aspect is, and that we can take advantage of. Over and above that, the compute power that's available for us to be able to train these large amounts, what's sometimes called a large corpus of data, large amounts of data, as part of these foundation models, which, like I said, will come up very, very shortly. So with that in mind, what's the benefit? What's the purpose behind generative AI? So as we can see here from this definition, generative AI can create new, unique content. What kind of content could that be? Well, I guess you potentially open up your imagination, because it could be, as you've maybe played around with, creating cute kitten pictures or something like that, videos of kittens or dogs, etc. But generating that new content, and I guess really what we need to think about is, depending on the industry you're in, there's potential, I guess, where this can benefit your organization or the customers that you may be working with. So we'll highlight a few of the options and some of the business use cases around that very shortly. Here's an example. There's a service that Amazon released called Code Whisperer. So if you're in the developer space, so maybe you are writing code, generating your own code can have its own challenges. So really what we can do with a tool like Code Whisperer is it's able to provide the code by just simply providing some kind of a comment in the code, and then it can give you suggested code options at that point. And as we can see, the benefit from a productivity perspective is quite high, with some examples shown here. During a preview, participants who were using Code Whisperer were more likely to complete the task successfully than those not. And of course, the speed with which the tasks could be completed significantly higher as well. So I'll give some references to Code Whisperer a little bit later on as I pop some things into the chat window. But you may want to be thinking about some other tasks or common use cases that your organization or the companies that you may be working for or working with can take advantage of generative AI. So some classic things, I guess, here from a customer experience, things like chatbots, virtual assistants. Those would be some common use cases where we can take advantage of generative AI. Content creation. Got some examples that I'll be showing you very, very shortly. So content creation, or code generation, like I've just mentioned with Code Whisperer, could be really giving the benefits of boosting employee productivity. Classic approach, I guess, if you're in the creative space. So, building unique images, building unique animations, video, etc. Some big opportunities, I guess, there that can be taken advantage of. And then finally, as we can see in this particular slide, improving business operations, so document processing, visual inspection, so on and so forth. And maybe just to to break away and give you some suggestions for where you might look further for this, let me just post a couple of links. I'll post the link that is related to Code Whisperer that I've already mentioned. So let me just give you that as a concrete example of a service that's available from AWS. And then let me also share a couple of use cases, both from AWS and a third party that's kind of been thinking about the economic potential, written a report around the economic potential of generative AI. So let me just get this from my other screen. And apologies, I forgot to label these two links. I think all of the other ones I've got are labeled. But if we have a look at that, maybe the first article, the first reference around this McKinsey Digital, just talking about the economic potential of generative AI and this idea of the next productivity frontier. So we can see it's about a year old in terms of the report, but lots of useful information that you can see around there. And as I scroll towards the bottom, I think there's got some good use cases where you can see how it potentially could benefit different parts of organizations, different types of organizations. So do have a look at that if you want as a reference. And then over and above that, if I can find the use cases from AWS, and some of which we've actually got some case studies that's also available as well. So in that first link that I've shared in the chat window, different scenarios, different customers, different use cases that you may find there as well. So I guess we're still very early days, I guess, in generative AI. It's really a relatively new technology. So we're probably going to see a lot more use cases starting to appear over time. But again, like I said, depending on your organization, the sector that you're working in, you may have potential use cases that you can think of. So that said, I'll just return back to the slides and I'll give you an example of how Amazon themselves are actually using generative AI. I'll avoid the term here just in case it wakes up your particular device. But for example, being able to create unique stories and drawings. So if you're entertaining young kids, for example, being able to create these stories and drawings directly with the assistant that Amazon have using generative AI. Like I said, if this is something you think may be useful, I'll provide a link around that if you want to find out how this works. Let me just give you this. So building kind of interactive stories for kids, of course, or big kids if you're like me. There's a link around that, create with the assistant. Now, in terms of where Amazon fit, or AWS in particular fit with this, it really depends on where you want to take advantage of the generative AI services. If you want to start from the bottom of this particular diagram, Amazon have got custom silicon that they've created, which is specifically designed to support your generative AI services that you may look to build yourself. So there's some custom silicon using what are called Trainium or Inferentia processors. So these are processors that Amazon themselves have built that are designed to help with the training part of it, if you're looking to build your own models, or the inferencing or the predictions. So this is optimized silicon for providing those capabilities. Again, I'll provide some references to both Trainium and Inferentia very shortly. But if you don't want to be building everything from scratch yourself, this is where, building your own models using a service that can provide the capabilities, that's where SageMaker comes into play. And as I said, SageMaker's been around for 6 or 7 years, so it's been around for a while. You don't necessarily have to use it for specifically generative AI. You can use it for the kind of classic machine learning, not necessarily for specifically generating new content. But again, we can work with those. And then finally, the one where I think the benefits start to become a lot clearer and using the capabilities without having to really do a lot of reinventing of the wheel, Bedrock. So this provides what are called foundation models as a service. So foundation models are something that's already been pre-trained by Amazon or a third party that you can take advantage of and really start to realize the benefits without having to go through a lot of the extra work of building your own models or building your own systems like the compute maybe provides. So again, through application programming interfaces, APIs, being able to call this Bedrock service and these various foundation models. So let me post a couple of links just related to that. Let me give you some links around those services. It's not necessarily in the order they were appearing, but let me just pop this into the chat window. So there's links directly to Bedrock, SageMaker, Trainium, Inferentia, and also a service called Amazon Q that you'll hear a lot of talk about in the coming weeks and months as well, that Amazon have released as a service in preview that you can take advantage of as well. So hopefully that gives you a starting point, but let's just continue on from there. The next few slides just give you some suggestions very similar to the earlier slides around some of the use cases for business. So whether you're in the healthcare industry, where you're looking to take advantage of generative AI and some of the suggested use cases or potential business use cases there, in life sciences for drug discovery, etc., in the financial services industry, potential offerings or use cases there. And then likewise, of course, if you're in the manufacturing space, how this could potentially be used for product design or other aspects like preventative maintenance of the systems themselves, retail, if you're in that kind of space, virtual try-ons that you can give for trying on products that you want to allow people to, of course, potentially look at and try on before purchasing. And then, of course, the big area that I mentioned as well, content generation for media and entertainment, news generation, etc., etc. So lots of potential use cases. And as I said, we're still early, I guess, in this journey. There are going to be more use cases that will come out over time. So that's hopefully just given us a little bit of a level setter, if you like, of understanding those various aspects and some of the terminology. If you have any questions, feel free, of course, to post, and I'll keep an eye on that as we're going along. I'll move on to this next section within this part, which is the importance of generative AI. And I think this is really good because it gives you a little bit of an example of how generative AI could be used in practice for a fictitious organization, but also some of the considerations, the risks and benefits that we do need to think about when we're balancing out, okay, well, we think generative AI is going to be giving us some benefits, but what are the risks that we need to think about as part of that process? So let's pretend for the next few slides that we're working for an organization that clearly, based on these pictures, is a shoe manufacturer. A pretty simple idea, and they're looking to release this new shoe. How can they use generative AI in these various aspects that we can see highlighted at the top? So we're going to talk about content summarization that we can use generative AI for, content generation, code generation, and maybe also the kind of the classic chatbot idea with Q&A. So how might that work for this fictitious organization? Well, the first thing they may need to do is provide some kind of executive summary report. So they've already got a detailed market research that they've been using to provide some potential insights to how this new walking shoe that they're going to be creating will be accepted in the market. And they want to take that market report and basically turn that into something that's going to be an executive summary. Now, you may have done this yourself if you've been playing around with things like ChatGPT, how it can take a particular document and say, summarize this for me. So this content summarization, we can see then the result of that. Terminology-wise, you'll hear this term called prompt. And the prompt is, if you like, the input, where we're actually asking the generative AI service to provide some response. And of course, the response is the output that we can see on the right-hand side. So that's one potential use case for our fictitious company. And then once they've got that content summarized, and the executives have given us the go-ahead and say, yeah, okay, we're keen to go with what you found there. Now we could use this for content generation. So at this point, into the prompt, the input, we put some information, say, well, we're looking now to build a product description that's going to be for this new shoe that we've built. And of course, we get the output, as you can see, as per the right-hand side. So this is being generated for us, and we can use that as, of course, part of the marketing process for this particular show. At which point, not only do we need to have something that, of course, that's going to be good for the website content, we've got to have something on social media. Again, we just change what we're putting into the prompt. Say, well, write something that's going to be available or used on social media based on the previous details. So it's remembering some of the history. I'm going to refer to that later on as context. So it's picked up on the context to say, okay, previously you asked for content generated that we're going to be putting on the web content for the website. Now we also need to use that same information to actually build something for social media, which of course, as we can see the results on the right-hand side. At which point, maybe we need some content that we can, of course, have as pictures. So we need some images. And our people developing this particular shoe, they've already got, a bit of a mock-up of what the shoe looks like. but maybe what we need to do is stylize that and say, well, actually, let's put that particular shoe and let's stylize that with the background of London, because this is where the fictitious shoe company is actually based. So, of course, as we can see here, it now brings that stylized photograph that we can then use for that social media or for the website, etc. Moving on from there, well, now we've got to actually have some content that maybe is going to be generated for some code. So, of course, I mentioned earlier on Code Whisperer. We're just seeing a little bit of an output that maybe what we need to do is actually have the developers who are writing some of the content, and they're going to be interacting with various services like Amazon's or AWS's S3 service. And through the comment that they're creating there, it can give some code generation as part of that Code Whisperer idea. Finally, we've got the product out to market. People are ordering the products from our fictitious company in the website. And maybe now what we'll do is we'll use the Q&A capabilities that can provide support for people who have ordered the product. So as we can see here, we've got a prompt where someone says, hey, I've ordered my shoe. I need to know when the ETA is for that. We can get that information from them and then generate through the generative AI solution that we've built some information to say, okay, well, here's the information about when you ordered your product. Here's when we're expecting to deliver it. Here's your reference accordingly. And it just gives you a little bit of an idea of how potentially generative AI could be used across all of these different scenarios in practice. There are risks that we do need to plan for. Now, we can see some references to some of you working in particular regulated environments, financial services, banking, for example. You might have specific requirements that you have to do and maintain. And also, how can we ensure that the private information is kept private as part of that? So there's those risks. What about the potential for bias? And when making the decisions based on generative AI, what's the potential risk of someone generating malicious content? So we've really got to kind of balance out those risks with the potential benefits that we can see listed at the bottom. So personalization of interactions, generating that novel content, the ability to use those pre-built models. So you don't really have to kind of reinvent the wheel. We can use what are called these LLMs, these large language models, these foundation models, really to start taking advantage and getting up to speed and using generative AI relatively quickly, and also automating, which is, I guess, a big thing in the industry anyway. But yeah, the gains that we might have through automation, code generation, etc., etc. Now, I'm going to post a couple of links I think that are worthwhile just as part of this discussion. Responsible AI in the generative era. Let me post a link there if you want to find out more information potentially about some of the considerations for responsibility with AI and generative AI. And then also, I know we've had a little bit of a blog update on our website. So if you want to see a little bit more about that, it's actually matching similar to what we're discussing today. But as we can see, it's prepping your team for generative AI, and it just has some of those considerations, some of the ethical considerations, some of the risks that we may need to plan for as part of a generative AI project. So there's a few things to think about there. Before I launch into part two, I thought I would just break up a little bit of the presentation with a couple of quick demos and a couple of references. So just bear with me as I go grab something. So I'm going to start with going into the AWS Management Console. So the AWS Management Console, some of you, if you're already in a kind of a technical role, you may already interact with the various Amazon Web Services through this Management Console. You don't have to. Yeah, there are other ways you can interact with it, but nice, quick visual demonstration of the Amazon Bedrock service. If you haven't seen this before, the service is available in certain parts of the world, certain what are called regions in AWS. There was an announcement that this is now available in Sydney. I know we may have some of you connected from Singapore, Tokyo, etc. But yes, certain regions, this service is available. I'm doing my demonstration from the US because this will work for me. But I'm just demonstrating what are called the Bedrock playgrounds, where I can just put something into the prompt, as we saw before. And in this case, because I'm based in Auckland, I say, well, generate for me, a skyline that I can have of the Auckland skyline, including what's called the Sky Tower, which of course you can see prominent in these particular pictures. And just to do something a little bit live rather than the pre-canned one, and I'll say including, we've got something called the Harbour Bridge. So the Harbour Bridge connects the north part of Auckland with the main city, so including the Harbour Bridge. should just get this running. It'll take a few minutes to generate it, but you'll just see how it can generate some novel content. And I'm doing something that's visual because it's quite nice and easy to see, of course, the visual generations. And you may have done something similar, like I said, generating pictures of cats or dogs or whatever has been your inspiration when you've used things like ChatGPT, for example. And as we can see, just while we're waiting for that to happen, these playgrounds are a good way of testing certain things within Bedrock. It doesn't have to be images, it could be text, it could be chat generation that's going to be used for that as well. So once this picture's come up, like we can see there's slight variation. I quite like that one there, which has the harbour bridge alongside, like I said, Sky Tower and some of the other large buildings, I guess, in Auckland. But take a bit of a rewind. This is showing us the end result. In order for me to do this, I need to have what is called some foundation models. And there are some foundation models that are provided as part of the service. So I'm just going to click into here, these foundation models. They're pre-trained, so there's content that, of course, I don't have to go through the training myself. These models will allow me to generate content as I need to. And we'll see some that are going to be specifically beneficial for doing things like text and visual, etc., etc. Now, they're actually broken down. If I just show you the providers, that might be a better plan. So they're broken down based on different providers. So we've got this AI21, have their Jurassic models. Amazon themselves have something called Titan that can be used for image or text generation. That's what I'm testing from, those pictures I showed you. Anthropic, so on and so forth. Meta, so on and so forth. So really, we can take advantage of potential foundation models. So we don't have to build everything ourselves. We can really start to incorporate those capabilities into our applications and services as need be. So there's a quick introduction to Bedrock by showing you the playgrounds, of course, the foundation models that we can take advantage of. And if I go back now, you'll see, if I go back to that image playground, the first thing we would start with is say, okay, well, which model would we like to generate our picture? Is it the Amazon Titan image generator, Stability AI's SDXL model? And likewise, of course, if I was using some of the other models, again, using some of the other playgrounds, I should say, choose the model, of course, that meets my requirements. So that's a quick demonstration of Bedrock. Similarly, if I can show you the SageMaker service. So the SageMaker service has been around longer than, of course, Bedrock, but also having access to the same foundation model. So again, here, as we can see here, I'm in the SageMaker service. I can take advantage through what's called SageMaker Jumpstart to similar kind of models. Now, why I might decide to do this is maybe I want to do some extra work. I don't want to just use the base foundation models. I want to do some customization. I want to do some modifications of the model. I can do so, and maybe I'll use Jumpstart, SageMaker Jumpstart specifically to do so. So again, that comes back to that picture that we had earlier on. Do I want to work with the custom silicon where I'm going to build my own compute systems that'll take advantage and then build my own foundation models, for example? Would I like to use SageMaker, which comes up into that middle level? Or would I like to use Bedrock, which means I don't really have to think about it? I can still do customizations in Bedrock. I should point that out. And we'll talk about some of the ways that can happen a little bit later on. So there's a quick demonstration of capabilities. And then my final thing that I wanted to share here is if you want to just see it from an application perspective, Amazon have released a website called partyrock.aws. And you can use this to kind of build generative AI applications and test things out. So you may want to, again, just experiment with that, have a look at some of those. I was getting sidetracked yesterday as part of this preparation. They've got some playgrounds, and they had some that were given this hackathon winners. So you can kind of try out using generative AI as a bit of a crime thriller where you've got information about a crime that's happened and you've got to investigate, manga creation tools, or even some kind of zombie attack that's there. So you can kind of work out how you might want to use different ways to deal with a zombie attack. And there's other ones as well. Those are just the ones that have won a specific prize through this hackathon. So I'll just share with you the link for that if I can get it from my other screen. Something you may want to play around with. Okay, so I'll just pop that into the chat window and I'll move back to the theory and let's talk about planning a generative AI project. Part 2 of the 3 parts. So we'll understand some of the technical foundations and terminology that relate to generative AI in this particular section, the risks and mitigations when using generative AI, and maybe some of the steps that you'll consider going through as you plan a Gen AI project. So starting first of all, technical foundations and terminology that's related to generative AI. I've already given part of the game away, but we're going to talk about foundation models. We'll talk about how those foundation models have been pre-trained using a large body of data, internet scale data that's of course been used to build those foundation models, and a little bit of the technical understanding that has happened underneath the hood with using what's called the transformer, tokens, word embedding, and context, all of which I've got specific slides for, so I'll just jump straight into those. So start with hopefully something you've picked up already from what I've demonstrated or discussed, foundation models. So really what organizations have done is they've taken this big, large body of data, sometimes referred to as a corpus of data in the context of text data, but they've taken all of this unlabeled data and they've placed it through some compute systems and run through some pre-training. And that provides those foundation models that we've just seen, which you can then adapt to your requirements. So now some foundation models are better at doing certain things than others, but whether it again is going to be content generation, pictures, text, whatever the requirements might be, we can now adapt that foundation model to what our specific task is that we're looking to achieve with that. That's one of the terms that you want to pick up with. And like I said, you may also hear the term large language models, LLMs. That's really ones that are specifically for large language text data that provide those foundation models. So yeah, the term large language model, foundation model pretty much overlap, specifically if you're dealing with text data. Now, what happens, of course, is it takes a lot of that data that's unlabeled, it's out there on the internet, and it builds through this training algorithm a foundation model. And of course, if you want to build your own foundation model, that's why, of course, we have services like SageMaker or the custom silicon, the Trainium processes that Amazon provide, where you can, of course, create your own foundation models if that's the area that you're looking to be in. Now, how does this work? Well, there was quite a revolution, I guess, in this particular part of the industry, this idea of transformer. So with the transformer idea, what it can do is it can look at the data, this unlabeled data, process it. It can take advantage of parallelization, so running things in parallel using the graphics processing units, and also understanding the information about meaning and position, for example, of words, the ability for it to understand what the meaning of the word is in the context of where it is. These transformers, they pay attention to multiple things at once in different ways, so that's how it's able to achieve these results. And it was actually through some research that was going on at Google at the time. So some engineers came up with this idea of this transformer idea, and it's the white paper, if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of it, it's referencing what's called attention is all you need. So I'm going to post a couple of links to this kind of transformer architecture, which really revolutionized, and that's kind of really the starting point for generative AI. But I'll pop a couple of links into the chat window. If you want to find out about this research that happened a few years ago, the attention is all you need. And like I said, it was a white paper that was created by Google, and that really made some significant changes in terms of how generative AI and these algorithms can actually look at the data. So have a look there if you want to dig deeper. But I'll give you a high-level overview of what the mechanisms that are used by this transformer technology. So let's say, for example, and I'm sure you've all seen this with kind of autocomplete, etc., in other contexts. But as we can see here in this particular statement, a puppy is to dog as kitten is to ... So how might generative AI predict what the next word should be? Well, in order for this to work, the words have to be encoded. Now, technically, they're not referred to as words, they're just called tokens. So tokens, smaller parts of the sentences that are words, phrases, or individual characters. So these tokens have to be somehow encoded. So they just kind of take the input, and as we can see, the same sentence there, puppy is to dog as kitten is to something. So each of those tokens, words in this context, has been given a particular number. Now, that's all happening behind the scenes, if you like, under the hood, by the algorithm. And then once the tokens have been encoded, given a number, we're back to the previous slide, we then, or the algorithm will then work out the word embedding. Now that represents that word and the relationship with other words. Now this is just a contextual representation of what it looks like. But as we can see, the words which have similar meaning, or the tokens that have similar meaning based on their encoding, they're going to be close together. So cat and feline, and of course maybe the younger feline, of course, referencing kitten. So this helps to bring out that contextual information about the relationship between these different words, which can help with, in this case, the prediction of this particular sentence. So of course, if we then see how once it's been encoded and it's got the embedding, it can then, in this case, for this use case scenario, predict the next word. And based on the level of confidence that the decoder has, it gives it a number. Of course, the higher the number, the more likely that word is what's going to be inserted at that point. Now, again, this is all about contextual understanding of what's happening with these models during the training process. And of course, completing this little demonstration, yeah, puppy is to dog, as kitten is to cat. So that's a little bit of background in terms of what's happened to help support generative AI. The other part, and you may have seen this yourself if you've worked with some of the generative AI solutions that are out there, is understanding context. So context is by default not necessarily going to persist. There's going to be a maximum size that you can have with that context. But it's really, if you've ever had a kind of conversation with a friend or a relative or something like that, you can go back to previous discussions you've had. Hey, do you remember that time you said X, Y, Z, or whatever it might be? And that's really the context. You've already got a starting point for the conversations that you're having with other people. Well, you've already got a context that you can use to refer back to. And we saw a little bit around the context generation, the content generation, I should say, when we saw the context example earlier on. So here's an example. Your first prompt, or your first input that you may have in this particular example, hey, what's the best place in Seattle to visit? So accordingly, the generative AI solution, in this case, some kind of chatbot, some kind of Q&A, say, hey, maybe you should go have a look at this particular part. I've never been to the Columbia Center in Seattle. If some of you have, maybe. That sounds very similar to what we've got in Auckland, being the Sky Tower. But yeah, breathtaking views of the city. I'm sure some of you in different parts of the world will have something similar that you can go to see the views of your city. At which point, really, this is where the context becomes useful. Will this be fun for children? So it knows, of course, in reference to the context, the conversation it's already been having, and of course then makes the response accordingly. So maybe not so good for kids. I don't know why the Columbia Center wouldn't necessarily be fun for kids. I'm sure they would love to see, and certainly when I remember when my son was very, very young, the jumping around that they would do on the big glass bricks that can make you a little bit nervous as you're seeing this big, or as you're standing and looking over this view of the city. So that's, again, context that we have to think about. Now, moving on from there, planning a generative AI project. And again, we've touched upon a few of the aspects that we may need to think about. And your considerations will follow these 4 steps. And again, there'll be other things that you'll start to incorporate as you mature, I guess, into this space as well. What's the scope? How are we going to use this? What's the model? That comes back to the foundation models. Do we need to make some changes and adapt the model to our own specific requirements before, of course, we have a use case? And again, just to give you a little bit of detail around it, the first step, I guess, in that process will be understanding how can we use generative AI? Is it something that we need to actually use? What's the scope? What are the potential benefits that we can have? What's going to be the cost implications of making those decisions? What are going to be the benefits, like I said, that we can maybe gain off the back of that? So really scoping out the viability of generative AI projects. First consideration, is it something we need to do? What's going to be the cost of that? What are then going to be the benefits? So again, that kind of cost-benefit analysis that we would incorporate. And again, maybe we're going to take something that's going to be a relatively easy win, just to give us some familiarity with using generative AI versus robust planning, which we still need to incorporate. But again, maybe just getting some experience initially on something that maybe is going to be an internal project rather than being customer facing, again, depending on what your requirements might be. At which point, what do I want to do? Okay, maybe we need to build a chatbot solution. And that chatbot solution is going to take advantage of one of those pre-trained models, those foundation models. And maybe I'd like to do some fine tuning. So optimizing that model for my purposes accordingly. And again, I'll provide some resources that you can use for fine tuning models as need be. And again, here's the ways that we can do this. Adapting the model, maybe we need to do some prompt engineering. You feed something into the model to adapt how it's going to behave. That's prompt engineering. And this is relatively easy to do compared to fine tuning, where you may need to actually provide some more data to the model. You've got your own custom data that you'd also like to incorporate and maybe add that to the pre-trained model. So prompt engineering, fine tuning, really adapting the model to your requirements. At which point, really the use of the model now, there's again a lot of considerations we would have here. Think back to the responsible AI discussions I had before. So what about the risks that we could have of malicious content maybe being created or generated, bias being introduced? So again, we may need to think about, is our training data biased as well? What about getting some feedback from users, tracking the performance of the model over time? And again, if you need to retrain it subsequently after you've done some changes that you need to make to the data itself, so retraining that fine-tuned model. So these are some of the considerations you'd have once you've kind of got the model in place that you'd need to plan for as well. Also, how we're going to deal with that feedback from the users. Maybe if we've got, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term hallucinations, where the generative AI model can provide content which looks genuine, sounds genuine, but is actually a hallucination. So again, this is where human intervention needs to come into play as well. And actually, I've got a quick example I'd like to show, which I thought was quite interesting when I was preparing for this this presentation as well. So let me just go off on a slight sideshow. And not sure if you're familiar with this organization. I know Amazon have partnered heavily with this organization called Leonardo.ai. So let me just provide their link at Leonardo.ai. And there was certainly a mention of them at the Sydney Summit, if any of you attended that fairly recently. So this is not necessarily criticizing them. I probably didn't make a good choice when I was doing this, but if I go to this Leonardo.ai, bear with me a second, I'll just get there. Leonardo.ai. Just want to get into the link so I can show you this. And they are, as I said, an Amazon customer and a partner that you can work with. Once I've got it, there we go. So let me just post this into the chat window. And they're very much in that kind of visual space. And they're an Australian organisation. I think there was a presentation, as I said, at the Sydney Summit that AWS had a few weeks ago, where they kind of started about a year ago with 6 people, and they're now up to 100 people as part of it. But what I thought was quite interesting, I thought I'd just have a bit of a play around with this yesterday as part of this little webinar. And I've got a particular interest in football. So I was explaining to my son yesterday, my teenage son, that I thought, oh, I'll just put something into this Leonardo.ai saying, you know, I've got a football player who's knee sliding after a goal. And if ever you've kind of watched football, some kind of things that struck me here is it didn't actually have what I was hoping for, where they're literally sliding because they're celebrating they scored a goal. Okay, and that's by the by. So I thought I'd change it around. I thought I'd put into the prompt, just show me a football player celebrating after scoring a goal. And I don't know whether you can see this visualization that we've got there, but it threw me initially. I might just zoom in a little bit more, just give that a bigger picture view. And I was thrown a little bit by it, and I thought, oh, there's some interesting effects that are happening there. And initially, I thought, oh, maybe there's someone else that's coming around behind and they're celebrating the goal. But there's, of course, clearly 4 arms there as opposed to 2 arms there. And actually, one of the arms has 2 thumbs. So clearly something that we would only be able to interpret ourselves. But I mean, that might be something that's generated by the AI tool that, of course, we need to have some kind of intervention, I guess, on there and understanding that this could be a potential hallucination that we may need to deal with. Now, I didn't go any further than that because I just thought it'd be quite interesting to have as part of the discussion today. I'm sure I can clean that up and, of course, get a better picture. That's not, again, trying to impact or say anything bad about Leonardo AI. I really wanted just to show you that tool. But of course, they are, as I said, a partner organization using AWS services, and they've got some really good examples of how customers have started using their products as well. So you may find that interesting to have a look at nonetheless. Another discussion I had with my son, teenage son, who's now able to use ChatGPT. He was doing some research for an English project, and he had to have some references to some Shakespeare quotes. And some of the challenges he then faced were again, there was this idea of a hallucination, where it was referencing a totally different play and giving him terms from that play to rather than the one he'd actually given as part of the prompt. So again, something that you need to be very, very mindful of as part of that feedback loop for your generative AI project. I'll continue, unless there's any questions, of course, feel free to post them into the chat window. I'll continue the presentation and really talk about evaluating the use of generative AI for your project. And I guess we've kind of dipped into some of these considerations, but the kinds of things that you may need to think about are, what are the risks? What are the risks that I need to think about when using generative AI? And can those risks be mitigated sufficiently so that your organization can take the benefits? So again, I mentioned this idea potentially of bias. The model should treat all variables equally with the absence of bias. You'll need to check, of course, whether that's the case. I generated a footballer picture, but it happened to be male. Why was it not necessarily female? So is there any bias within the training itself, which could impact and, of course, provide bias when it's providing the content? So that needs to be considered. For example, is there going to be any bias if you've got some kind of financial service that you're recommending or approving? Is there bias based on certain criteria? You'll need to investigate whether that's the case. Also, not exposing personally identifiable information. Got to make sure that, of course, private data is kept private. I mentioned this idea of hallucinations. Of course, that was my demonstration just before we wrapped up. But, potentially, we've got to make sure the generative AI solution will not generate toxic content. So something that, of course, we might want to mitigate by putting some guardrails in place, or potentially making sure the training data doesn't have anything that could be used to generate that kind of toxic content. Hallucinations, how are we going to potentially deal with that? What about the risk of leaking of intellectual property? I guess the discussions that maybe you've been party to or heard, well, if I'm now generating some content and I've used the basis of a particular artist, how do we then reference their intellectual property as part of that? Plagiarism and cheating. So again, if you've got some kind of guardrails in place for your organization, how do we ensure that people are, of course, not cheating, using the system, of course, and then taking someone else's content and, of course, passing it off as their own? And this is something that, like I said, it's interesting to see my teenage son at school. They basically said, well, you're allowed to use ChatGPT, you do have to reference it. But again, that nature, of course, of having to really fact check all the information that is provided by that generative AI application. And it's certainly going to be disruptive to the nature of work. And I guess we're in those early stages of this big wave of generative AI, but understanding the impact it's going to have to employees and also the benefits, I guess, that we have, that we gain from off the back of that. So there's a few things to consider there, and I will, again, post references. Hopefully most of you have been in the session from the beginning, but just in case you haven't, just a couple of references around that responsible AI. Also a link to our blog, so a bit of a reference there, which does have some references to, again, some of the considerations. And I will repost that same link through the McKinsey report that talks about it, because there's some good references in there around some of the risks and benefits that I guess organizations need to consider. That said, I'll move into our final part of the session, which is building a generative AI ready organization. By now, hopefully, over the first two parts, you have a little bit of a feel for what generative AI is about, what the potential use cases might be, some of the risks, the considerations, and the services that can support it. But how do you then move forward with this? So some three things, I guess, that we'll look at specifically in this part: preparing your organization, making sure that your organization is set for success, and the potential things that you could take advantage of now and take action on. So preparing your organization, what exactly does a generative AI ready organization look like? It's going to start from the top, getting, of course, leaders who can drive the discussions around generative AI, but also making sure employees are confident and comfortable with what it's going to mean for them. What are the risks that employees might be thinking, oh, well, I'm potentially going to lose my job. but can I gain something out of this by, of course, being on this bleeding edge, if you like, of this technology? So some considerations, I guess, there. Absolutely take a people first approach to delivering something that maybe is going to put your organization ahead of other organizations. So remaining competitive. If you're not doing it, maybe if your competitors are, there's a risk, of course, that you're going to be left behind there. But providing employees with the training and resources they're going to need to understand generative AI. And like I said, it's a new technology. So understanding that this change in culture what this technology will bring with regards to a change in culture, and of course the transformation the organization may need to go through. And I said, like I said, it's very much driven from the top. So those of you, I guess, in a kind of a leadership role, making sure, of course, you're providing the resources that your employees need. Understand, are we ready for this? What's going to be the impact of the change on employees? So it's really some of those considerations that you'll need to incorporate as part of your thought process. And making sure, of course, employees understand, well, what exactly is generative AI? And this might be part of the reason why some of you are here, because you need to understand what it is and know that it's not necessarily always going to impact job security, but how it could create new opportunities, I guess, there, if you're at this forefront of this new technology, and what the benefits that it can gain for you as an individual or your organization. But providing feedback, of course, setting some kind of guardrails, I guess, that can be applied to your employees as they're using it, setting the boundaries, I guess, where generative AI can potentially be used to, of course, reduce the likelihood of abuse of generative AI. Absolutely. Now, at that point, how are we going to help to prepare the employees themselves, understanding what it is? And again, like I said, that might be part of the reason and your motivation for being here. And it's really, as its core aspect, although it's a kind of a revolutionary technology, it's really just large pre-trained models that we can take advantage of. So, of course, the model instead of focusing on a specific use case like we would have for machine learning. So if we're building our own machine learning model, we might feed in lots of credit card data to look for fraudulent transactions, like I was describing before, lots of email messages we can identify, or it can identify spam emails. But really, these are pre-built with large amounts of data as part of those foundational models. So understanding how they can then be used and adapted to your use case. Like I said, there's going to be concerns. People are going to be concerned with this new technology. What is it going to mean for me as an employee? And really, like I said, there are potential gains. And if you can augment your job role with AI, you're going to get those benefits. So this AI-assisted future is really where things are going. So take the example, if I'm a developer, I'm writing code. Hey, I'd like to be able to have something that's going to really get me quicker to be able to write that code so I can focus on what does my code actually need to do. And of course, then there's going to be potential new products. I mentioned, of course, Leonardo AI, new companies that are going to be built directly out of this generative AI technology, and new roles, of course, that you may have within your organization. So there's, again, potential. And I'm sure if like me, you kind of see a lot of new products or a lot of products that are already out there, and they're incorporating. So whether it's Zoom as we're connecting through at the moment, and of course, maybe giving summarizations of what this meeting was all about. You can have generative AI providing that as part of your product that maybe you're already incorporating. Automation of tasks. So again, maybe if you're using generative AI to write code, it can automate tasks, maybe also make it easier for customers who are needing to get information. Of course, building these kind of chatbots to give them the information they need to have, and potentially, of course, reducing costs. But new products, new services, new marketing campaigns. So the potential for growth, and like I said, if you reference that report, the potential for growth in the industry is pretty massive. And I guess so this is kind of a feedback loop, I guess. Starting, I guess, bottom right, I suggest, where, of course, we're thinking about the planning and the understanding of, okay, well, how can we potentially use generative AI, getting that feedback, and, of course, using that feedback loop to, of course, encourage and continue more innovation, I guess, around how generative AI could be used within your organization. But it's an ongoing process. Again, I'm sure some of you have been in the industry a similar kind of time to me, and you can probably tell from my haircut, I've been here for a long time. But yeah, it's a new technology. So, of course, we need to have that learning, the adaptation because the new technology has emerged, we need to, of course, make sure that we're on top of that. So again, keeping current and remaining competitive, as it suggests, in the job market. How might an organization set themselves up for success? Some considerations to think about there. Of course, this presentation is clearly based around Amazon Web Services. So, of course, taking advantage of the cloud, which means you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So can I take advantage of services like Bedrock? Can I, if I wish to, go down a level and maybe start working with SageMaker to build my own foundation models if you've got large amounts of data that you want to build a foundation model around? So the cloud operating model is going to be part of those considerations. We'll talk about team success and also putting some governance in place around it. So again, cloud operating model, really, like I said, if some of you are already working with AWS, the fact that you can consume this as a service is really going to make your life a lot easier because you're not reinventing the wheel. But of course, in order to do so, you need to understand the services, how they can benefit, and which services in particular you wish to use as part of that process. So like I said, maybe you're starting from the bottom, you want to use, as we saw in a really earlier slide, of Trainium. In Inferentia, they're kind of core silicon. Maybe I want to use SageMaker. Maybe I want to use Bedrock as part of that. So understanding that, and maybe also getting guidance. So working with consulting partners like AWS themselves, their consulting services, partner organizations you may already be working with that can provide some kind of proof of concepts, some guidance, some advice, so you can actually do some testing and validation. Also looking at the data that you've got there, is it going to be available for you to, of course, run your own training and testing as need be? And like I said, if you're already an AWS customer, the fact that you can just use this and consume this cloud infrastructure as a service really is going to save you a significant amount of time and effort to build a generative AI set of systems. But also think about those responsible aspects, the security, the privacy, and ways to, of course, evaluate and improve. So it's a continuous kind of improvement that you'll need to provide for any AI systems that you're creating. Some of you may have strong governance requirements. So of course, you need to provide accountability and transparency for that, and think about some of the ethical principles and guidelines that we've mentioned as well. So privacy, fairness, non-bias, non-discrimination, etc., that need to be considered with that. As mentioned, regulatory requirements, if you're in the financial services industry, for example, making sure that you're meeting those requirements, what kind of governance we need to have there, but also continuing education. So again, empowering users to be able to take advantage of AI. It is a new technology. So of course, there's going to be new things emerging off the back of that, but everyone understanding what the potential is and kind of growing with that as well. Also considering that data privacy and security. Again, particularly if you're an organization that you need to make sure that the data is well protected, how can we ensure and how can we audit the fact that we have met those requirements? So from here on in, I guess the kind of the call to action, if you like, the steps to go through is incorporating generative AI thinking into your organization, and of course, upskilling, making sure we understand what the potential is, and putting together projects that we can take advantage of what Gen AI can offer. So again, some of the things that you may want to consider: what's a potential business use case? How could we benefit from using generative AI? Have a look at those case studies, those business use cases that I shared earlier on in the session. Understanding to the individual stakeholders within the organization how it can be used. So this education and training. Try things out. So of course, experimenting with small scale projects. I mentioned, of course, earlier on, you don't necessarily want to go large necessarily with everything and being gung-ho, but being able to get some experience with generative AI, testing the waters, gaining that experience before, of course, you go with larger projects that you might benefit from as well. Thinking strategically, how are we going to plan for this? So what's our strategy for incorporating and integrating generative AI into your organization? So giving those kind of guardrails as need be. And then starting with a phased approach, if you are launching with it, standard kind of new project that you need to think about, pilot project, and then expanding as need be. Monitoring and the operational aspects that you'll then have to think about. How effective has it been? Have we gained what we expected? And of course, with new technology, there's going to be success and failure. So understanding where there has been successes, where there's been failures, and of course, learning those lessons. And it's part of, I guess, the adoption of new technology. Not everything's going to go right first time, but of course, making sure that we do gain some learnings, I guess, from any of the failures that may happen as part of the process. Now, specifically, I'm here to talk to you about some of the potential that you can have for training to new staff roles. I've got a couple of training courses that may be useful for some of you, and we've got some links that we're going to be sharing very, very shortly. But yeah, think about the training aspect, the hands-on experience with working with these generative AI tools. I've very briefly demonstrated, of course, how they can be used, but also sharing that knowledge, I guess, within the organization as well. So collaboration, knowledge sharing within the organization, the individuals that you're supporting. Ongoing from there, coaching and mentoring, guidance, feedback that the employees can take advantage of, and maybe potentially even incentives that can be offered for individuals who do upskill themselves and get into this kind of generative AI space, which, like I said, could potentially open up new markets and new opportunities for the organization. So let me just post a couple of resources. I'll do a couple of quick shares at this point. For those of you who want more of a practical aspect with some of the things we've looked at, let me share with you a resource and I'll give you some direct links. So if you want some exposure through workshops, there's a website called workshops.aws. I'll post this individual link into the chat window. And this is actually not just specifically around generative AI. This is a website that's managed and maintained by AWS to help you understand their various products. And as you can see here, if I just go into the category, which is AI/ML, you'll see various projects or workshops that you can go through, which will give you some practical examples. So as we can see, it's something called prompt engineering. So this, of course, optimizing the foundation model for your specific requirements. This is one of the ways that we can kind of adapt the foundation model for us. We'll see a reference to that one, and specifically using a particular FM or foundation model called Anthropic Claude version 3. Generative AI for advertising and marketing industry, if any of you are in that particular industry, so on and so forth. So there's also going to be references to SageMaker, deploying large language models, again, references to Trainium, Inferentia. And I'll just show you maybe the first one. That's probably the quickest one to go to. If I click on the Get Started here, this will give you a bit of a guided walkthrough, in this case of doing prompt engineering with Anthropic's Claude v3 foundation model. So the good thing is, of course, this will give you the walkthrough of doing that. The aspects that you may need to think about are, of course, incorporated in here in terms of what your background should be, how long it may take to complete, and the fact you'll need to provide some resources to run this. So because this particular one, you're not necessarily going to be running at AWS, you might be running it in your own space, you'll need to run through some steps to get access to these services. So you may need to say, hey, I'd like to use these particular foundation models. You'll request them from AWS and you'll get approval to then use them accordingly. So here's where you may need to run this, bring your own account set up. So you'll need to have an AWS account that you can use for testing purposes. So that's a good way of getting some practical experience. If I just search for the workshops, there's a couple around specifically Bedrock. So setting up a chatbot using Bedrock, building generative AI. There's Party Rock being mentioned, which was an application interface that I shared earlier on. Amazon Q as well as Bedrock. Bedrock with something called LangChain that can do some coordination and orchestration for you, so on and so forth. And I've just got a few that I'll just post directly, but you can see there's lots there. If I change my search term instead of Bedrock to SageMaker, you'll see references to how you might be able to use SageMaker for performing certain tasks. And again, a workshop with instructions that you can walk through. So lots of good resources, educational resources that are there. I'll post direct links to 2 of those, but you can see there's a whole host of other ones that you may find useful. So I'll just pop that into the chat. And of course, things outside of Bedrock and SageMaker, if you want to get familiar with other AWS services, they're also in that general kind of workshop AWS link that I shared earlier on. So do have a look at those. I think I've posted most of the links that I want to. I'm just checking through my list there. As we get to the end of this particular workshop, you're welcome to ask any questions. If you do have any, feel free to pop into the chat window. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes, I guess, of time left before we wrap up our 90-minute session. So feel free if you want to type something up. I will post some resources very, very shortly. But as a part of a follow-up, there's a link that we have, which is upskilling your team on generative AI. So there's an ebook that we're providing. Fiona, I'm not sure if you're going to post the link directly. I might just go grab it from the slide just in case. So this is, well, I'll label it first. So this is an ebook which just has some of the considerations around getting your team ready for generative AI. I'll just post that into the chat window. And then we also have some learning plans. So these learning plans, if you're in a technical role and you want to get some hands-on experience with the various services, combination of training that we can provide as instructor-led using tools like Zoom as we've done today. So again, depending on where your starting point is, we've got this AI blended learning pathway, some of which is content that we can provide as instructor-led training, virtual instructor-led training through Zoom, plus also on Amazon's platform called Skill Builder. If you're not already familiar with Skill Builder, it's a good place to get content and training from AWS. The link for that is just skillbuilder.aws. Some of the services are free, or some of the resources that are on there are free. Some are based on a paid subscription. I'll post that directly into the chat window. So in my little PowerPoint, anything that you're seeing over as a reference to digital skill builder, that's something you can do self-paced. Anything that's instructor-led training is a service that we provide at bespoke training services. And some of the training courses I personally will run myself, like, for example, a 4-day course on machine learning or a 2-day course on building generative AI applications. A relatively new course that was released, I think only about last month or earlier this month. They released a new course, 2-day training course on developing generative AI applications. Now, similar kind of thing for the ML space, but maybe more focused on the machine learning, which covers off more around SageMaker. So we've got these resources available and will be shared. And I've just seen your question, Namrata, if I pronounced the name correctly. Any resources for microservices breaking monolith into microservice? Is it only SageMaker or some other? Good question. If you're building something that's going to be a more kind of modern application design microservices, we don't probably cover too much around that in the kind of the machine learning space, but the kinds of courses that I would look at would be understanding and developing the modern application. So we've got a developing course that covers that off, and then containers. So looking at things like Elastic Kubernetes service and things like that, but breaking monolith to a microservice, there's probably some reference resources available on AWS. Let me see if I can post something. Actually, just before I do that, Namrata, and I know if some of you haven't necessarily seen the question that Namrata's asking, it's kind of not specifically around machine learning or artificial intelligence, but a real good general question around AWS and building microservices. Before I do that, I want to just give a couple of references in the chat window to those training courses that I referenced. There's a 2-day course on developing generative AI applications and a 4-day course on machine learning, which is very much focused on SageMaker. So like I said, I've got a bit of a vested interest. It's the training courses that I run. But to answer your question, Namrata, there's probably some good documentation breaking a monolith into a microservice. I should probably use a generative AI search for this. Let's see if we can find something on AWS. So yeah, there's I'm sure I've seen something like that. So decomposing monoliths into microservices or breaking one down. Like I said, not specifically related to the content we've discussed, but you may need to think about it as you're building a new application, planning to have that application built as a microservice, absolutely. But for you and anyone else interested in this, so Namrata, I think it was your question, I'll just post these 2 links in chat, but it just gives you some guidance around that. It's not an area that I'm particularly strong on, if I'm honest with you. I don't really do a lot of development myself. So I've got a colleague who does a lot of the developer courses. That will probably be more in their space. But here's a couple of quick references that may give you a starting point. So bear with me, I'll just pop those into the chat window. So please, at the end of the webinar, hopefully it's been very useful for you. Please do have a look at the form that Fiona, my colleague, has just posted. Give your feedback, what you thought was good, what you thought was could work with some improvement. But hopefully you've all had a valuable gain from the 90 minutes. I want to thank you all for your time and patience. Hopefully you've gained some greater knowledge and understanding of what generative AI and these various services, how they may support you for the future. Feel free if you do have any questions. I guess we've got a couple of minutes to wrap up, but thanks so much for your time and patience. If you need to drop off the session, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, morning, wherever you might be in the world, and all the best for the future. I may bump into some of you, of course, on training courses in the future. So all the best, and thanks again for attending.